The soil here is black, river dark, dense with silt carried down from mountains hundreds of miles to the north. A scribe kneels in the city of Nippur in the heart of Mesopotamia, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with a reed stylus. He is recording a story older than the city he sits in, older, perhaps, than writing itself. The Sumerians call this place Dilmun, a land where the raven does not cry, where the lion does not kill, where the sick man does not say, "I am sick," a world before grief, before death, a garden at the beginning of everything. Hundreds of miles away, in a different tradition, other scribes will one day set down a different version of the same memory. A garden, 4 rivers, 2 trees at its center. A God who walks there in the cool of the evening air. And then, a threshold crossed, a gate sealed, and the garden gone. People have been searching for it ever since. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the Garden of Eden, what Genesis actually describes, where serious scholars and archaeologists have looked, and what the ancient Near East can tell us about the tradition behind the most famous garden in human history. To understand the geography of Eden, you need to understand the world the Genesis account was written into. The ancient Near East, the arc of fertile land stretching from the Persian Gulf through the river plains of Mesopotamia and up into the Levant, was home to some of the world's earliest and most complex civilizations. The Sumerians built cities in what is now southern Iraq as far back as 5000 BC. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians followed in succession. Each of these cultures left behind a substantial body of written literature, thousands of clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script, telling stories about creation, floods, paradise, and the relationship between gods and human beings. This is the intellectual and cultural world Genesis speaks into. The authors of the Hebrew Scriptures were not writing in isolation. They were writing in conversation with, and in places in deliberate contrast to, the myths and cosmologies of their neighbors. The rivers they name, the metals they describe, the sacred landscape they evoke. All of it would have been immediately recognizable to a listener anywhere in the ancient Near East. That shared vocabulary is important. It means the Genesis account of Eden is not simply a story about a specific location. It is also a statement about the kind of place Eden was, placed in a world of rivers and mountains and precious metals that the earliest listeners knew as the real world. It was designed, in other words, to sound true. And for 2.5 millennia, people have been trying to determine whether it also is. The Genesis account of Eden is precise in a way that has driven interpreters to distraction for centuries. It does not simply say there was a garden at the beginning. It tells you where the garden was. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, Genesis chapter 2 says, and from there it divided. It had 4 headwaters. Those 4 rivers are named the Pishon, the Gihon, the Hiddekel, identified explicitly in the text as the Tigris, and the Euphrates. 2 of these are immediately and confidently locatable. The Tigris and Euphrates are 2 of the longest rivers in Western Asia, rising in the highlands of eastern Turkey and flowing south through what is now Iraq, before emptying into the Persian Gulf. They were the defining arteries of Mesopotamian civilization. Their names appear in records going back to the very earliest written texts in human history. But the Pishon and the Gihon are a different matter, and the problem is not that ancient readers had nothing to say about them. It is that what they said points in opposite directions. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, identified the Gihon with the Nile. The intertestamental Book of Jubilees, written perhaps 2 centuries earlier, agreed with him. The reasoning was direct. Cush, in nearly every other place the Hebrew Bible uses the word, means the kingdom of Cush, the ancient land of Nubia, south of Egypt, along the Upper Nile, and the Pishon's land of Havilah, associated in Genesis with gold, bdellium resin, and onyx stone, lines up in the genealogies of Genesis 10 with the mineral-rich regions of the Arabian Peninsula. That ancient geographical reading places Eden's 4 rivers flowing toward Mesopotamia, toward Africa, and toward Arabia simultaneously. A garden with rivers on 3 separate continents resists any single fixed location on a map. The most traditional popular proposal simply ignores that difficulty. It places Eden at the convergence of the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq, near the city of Basra. The reasoning seems logical at first. 2 of the 4 rivers are there, so the garden must be nearby. A particular tree near the Iraqi town of Kurna was marked on travelers' maps for centuries as the biblical tree of knowledge, and the site attracted pilgrims and tourists well into the modern era. But this is popular tradition, not scholarship. The problem is that the Tigris and Euphrates do not divide into 4 headwaters near Basra. They converge into one. The geography of the text, read literally, does not fit the modern landscape at the river mouth. That observation eventually led some researchers to ask a different question. What if the modern landscape is not the relevant one? At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were dramatically lower than they are today. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow body of water, would then have been dry land, a broad lowland river valley fed by drainage systems pouring down from the western Arabian highlands, the Zagros Mountains of Iran, and the great rivers flowing south from Mesopotamia. Wildlife, freshwater, human settlement. Then the ice retreated and the oceans rose. Over thousands of years, marine water crept northward through the Strait of Hormuz, claiming the valley floor slowly and without relent. What had been habitable land disappeared beneath the sea. By roughly 6000 BC, the Persian Gulf as we know it today had taken shape, and whatever had been there before was buried under meters of water. The archaeologist Juris Zarins first proposed in the 1980s that 2 of Eden's missing rivers might be identified through satellite imagery. Analysis of the Arabian Peninsula revealed a large, ancient river channel, long since buried beneath desert sand, crossing what is now Kuwait and northeastern Saudi Arabia before draining northward toward the Gulf. Zarins proposed this channel, sometimes called the Kuwait River or the Wadi Batan system, as a candidate for the Pishon. The Karun River in southwestern Iran, a major river still flowing today, became his candidate for the Gihon. If those identifications are correct, all 4 rivers of Genesis converge at the northern end of what is now the Persian Gulf, which is currently underwater. The geologist and anthropologist Jeffrey Rose developed this geological picture further in a landmark 2010 paper published in the journal Current Anthropology. mapping what he called the Persian Gulf oasis, a vast, fertile lowland basin that would have supported significant human populations through much of the last ice age. Rose's primary argument was demographic. He was tracking early human migration and population patterns, not searching for a biblical garden. But biblical geographers were quick to notice that his environmental reconstruction placed a lush, well-watered basin at the precise geographical convergence point of Genesis's 4 rivers, and that this entire landscape had been swallowed by the sea as water levels rose, perhaps around 8 to 6,000 BC. The environmental reconstruction is serious and has been engaged in peer-reviewed literature. The satellite imaging of the ancient river channel is real. The flooding of the Gulf Basin is geological record. But whether the Genesis narrative is drawing on this specific landscape is a different and far more difficult question, and most scholars maintain a careful distance from that conclusion. The ancient identification of the Gihon with the Nile, the view held by Josephus, by Jubilees, and by much of early Jewish and Christian interpretation, creates a geographical problem that the Gulf oasis theory alone cannot fully resolve. That tension has led some scholars to look closer to Mesopotamia. Several have noted that a region called Kish, rendered in some ancient transcriptions as Cush, existed in the river plains of ancient Mesopotamia near Babylon, entirely separate from the African Cush. If Genesis is using Cush in that Mesopotamian sense rather than the African one, the Gihon remains in the Near Eastern world, and the geographical picture shifts toward the Gulf region considerably. That identification remains debated and has never been resolved to universal satisfaction. Most mainstream biblical scholars today approach the geography of Eden not primarily as a literal map reference, but as a literary and theological device. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, a source from which 4 rivers flow outward to encompass the known world is a statement about totality, about a place that is not one location among many, but the origin of everything. Eden in this reading is not a specific address. It is the center of the world before the world was broken. That interpretation gains considerable weight from the broader literature of the ancient Near East. The Sumerian paradise land of Dilmun, that pure, bright, deathless land recorded on tablets at Nippur, predates the Genesis account by centuries and shares its essential architecture, a sacred, abundant space where the normal terms of human existence do not apply. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a jewel garden at the ends of the earth where precious stones grow from trees. Sacred garden imagery associated with temples and royal palaces appears throughout Mesopotamian archaeology. Cylinder seals from as early as the 3rd millennium BC show figures seated beside stylized trees, attended by serpents, in compositions that biblical scholars have long connected to the Eden iconography of Genesis. None of this means Genesis borrowed directly from Sumerian sources. Both the Hebrew and the Mesopotamian traditions were addressing the same profound questions about origins, about perfection, about what the world looked like before human history began, and reaching for a common landscape of rivers, trees, and sacred enclosures to give those questions their setting. What archaeology has actually found in the places where Eden has been most seriously sought is a layered and honest record of what we know and what we do not. At Eridu, known today as Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, Excavations conducted by British teams in the 1940s revealed some of the earliest occupation layers in all of Mesopotamia, dating to approximately 5,400 BC. It is important to be precise here. Those earliest layers represent a modest Ubaid period shrine and village settlement, not yet a fully realized city by modern archaeological standards. Larger urban centers like Uruk developed later. What distinguishes Eridu above all else is its place in Sumerian literary tradition. It is the city the Sumerians themselves named as the first city ever built, the place where, in their cosmology, kingship descended from heaven to earth. Its early temple complex sat at the edge of what was once a large freshwater marsh, fed by underground springs pushing up through the alluvial plain. Some scholars have proposed Eridu as a possible anchor for the traditions Eden draws on. That remains a suggestion rather than a conclusion, and the connection is thematic rather than evidential. The satellite imaging that supports the identification of the Kuwait River system as the Pishon has been independently confirmed as showing a genuine ancient drainage channel. The channel is real. Its identification with the Pishon is speculative, and the text of Genesis offers insufficient detail to confirm or rule it out. The flooding of the Persian Gulf basin is not in dispute. It is geological and marine record. Sea levels in that region rose significantly between roughly 15,000 and 6,000 BC, progressively inundating a substantial area of previously habitable landscape. Whether that event generated a cultural memory that contributed, in any form, to the Genesis narrative cannot currently be determined. What archaeology has not found is a datable site, a specific enclosure, or any physical evidence corresponding to the Eden of Genesis as a locatable place. Constraints on excavation across Iraq, Kuwait, and the submerged Gulf floor have been severe for decades. But the honest summary is this: the text provides geographical coordinates. The ground has not confirmed them. And the question of whether Genesis intends a literal location or a cosmological one remains genuinely open in serious scholarship. Every human culture that has left a written or oral record has told some version of this story. A world as it was supposed to be. A time before things went wrong. A garden, a beginning, a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Eden is not unique to Genesis in that sense. What Genesis does is give it a name, a geography, and a set of questions that have refused to go quiet for 3,000 years. Where was it? Could it be found? What would it mean if it could? But what is placed at the center of the Genesis garden is not power, not wealth, not the triumph of one people over another. It is two trees, knowledge and life, and a question about what it means to be human in relation to both. That question does not require a set of coordinates to be real. It has been asked by every generation that has ever tried to answer it. The garden may be mappable, it may be submerged, it may be everywhere and nowhere at once. The question it contains is harder to lose. If this story has stayed with you, Bible Stories Unearthed has a growing library of e-books that go deeper into the archaeology and history behind the biblical world. You'll find the link to our author page in the description below. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.